Here's a question nobody actually wants to answer honestly. Who has it worse? Millennials or Gen Z? And before you say both generations had it hard and move on, stick with me for a second. Because this isn't about sympathy. This isn't about trauma Olympics. This is about running the actual numbers. And when you run them, the salary numbers, the debt numbers, the mental health numbers, something uncomfortable shows up. The story we've been telling ourselves, the one that says every generation struggles, that's just life, starts to collapse. What's left underneath it is a picture of two groups of people, both stuck, but stuck in completely different ways. And understanding the difference is actually useful. I've been at enough dinner tables to know how this conversation goes. The millennial in the room says, "We graduated into a recession. There were no jobs. We had nothing." And the Gen Z cousin fires back, "Cool story. Try paying $2,400 a month for a studio apartment on a $42,000 salary." And here's the thing, they're both right. That's the problem. When both sides are technically correct, the argument becomes a distraction. The real question isn't who suffered more. The real question is, what actually got worse? What stayed the same? And what does the data say when you strip out the noise? That's what we're doing today. Here's what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to tell you one generation is lazy and the other one is resilient. I'm not going to repeat the avocado toast joke, that one retired in 2019, and I'm not going to moralize at you about hard work and perspective. What I'm going to do is walk you through 5 specific areas where these two generations actually diverge, with data. And in at least 2 of those areas, the gap is wide enough that it should genuinely make you uncomfortable. Because you're not behind, you're just playing the wrong game. And step 1 is understanding which game you're actually in. Let's set the stage. Millennials, born between 1981 and 1996, hit adulthood inside 2 of the most destabilizing events in modern American history. First, 9/11 reshaped the entire cultural and political landscape before most of them had even entered the workforce. Then, just as they were graduating and applying for entry-level jobs, 2008 happened. The financial system imploded. Unemployment spiked. Entry-level positions evaporated. The recession didn't just damage millennials economically, it delayed everything. Marriage, kids, homeownership, career traction, the whole timeline got pushed back by roughly a decade. That is the millennial origin story. A generation shaped by institutional collapse at the exact moment they were trying to enter institutions. Gen Z's origin story is different, but not lighter. Born between 1997 and 2012, the oldest Gen Zers were still teenagers when the smartphone became the default mode of human interaction. They didn't adopt social media. They grew up inside it, during adolescence, during the formation of identity and self-worth, during the years when the brain is most sensitive to comparison and rejection. Then COVID-19 hit, during some of the most formative years of early adulthood. Not just economically, socially, psychologically, developmentally. The pandemic didn't disrupt Gen Z's economy alone, it disrupted their nervous system, their social architecture, their relationship with presence and reality. That's not a small detail. Both generations were forged by rupture, both carry the residue of watching institutions fail in real time, but here's where the paths diverge. Millennials got hit hard early, and then, slowly, things stabilized. Many are now in their 30s and 40s, scarred but functional. Gen Z got hit hard early, and the instability just continued, wearing a different outfit each year. Inflation, housing supply collapse, algorithm-driven social isolation, climate anxiety as background noise. It's a different flavor of the same poison, and what makes it harder to treat is that it doesn't come from one single crash. It comes from a system that keeps quietly raising the floor. Now let's look at the 5 pillars where the numbers tell the real story. Pillar 1, the job market. Here's the stat that surprises people. 87% of Gen Z currently has a job, the lowest youth unemployment rate since 1991. On paper, Gen Z is employed. So why does it feel like an entire generation is financially underwater? Because employment and financial stability stopped being the same thing. The average Gen Z salary, adjusted for inflation, sits around $45,000. Millennials at the same age were averaging approximately $52,000 in equivalent purchasing power. BLS 2024, that's a $7,000 annual gap before you even factor in what that money actually buys in 2025 versus 2014. Being employed is not the same as being okay, and that distinction matters more now than it ever has. The salary gap is only half the story. The other half is how Gen Z is perceived inside the workplace they're underpaid to show up to. A 2024 survey found that between 38 and 45% of respondents across all generations named Gen Z as the most difficult colleagues to work with. Meanwhile, 42% said millennials were their preferred generational cohort. Now, is that perception entirely fair? Probably not, but it has real consequences. It affects who gets mentored, who gets promoted, who gets the benefit of the doubt when something goes wrong at work. Being technically employed and actually thriving professionally are two very different games. Gen Z is stuck winning one and losing the other simultaneously. That's the setup for everything that follows. Pillar 2, money and debt. This is where it gets genuinely alarming. Yes, millennials graduated into a recession, but many responded by avoiding credit entirely, which hurt their credit scores long term but prevented them from spiraling into revolving debt. Gen Z doesn't have that option. The cost structure has changed. Gen Z's credit card balances are 25% higher than millennials were at the same age. Their debt-to-income ratio sits at 16% and climbing. Inflation has turned every basic expense, rent, groceries, car insurance, utilities, into a non-negotiable drain on a salary that hasn't kept pace. You can't opt out of eating. You can't negotiate your rent down by being more disciplined. The math simply doesn't work. And that's not just anecdotal. Deloitte's 2025 Gen Z and Millennial survey found that more than half of both generations are living paycheck to paycheck. But here's the critical distinction. Millennials who are paycheck to paycheck are largely in their late 30s and 40s, absorbing mortgage stress, childcare, and family costs, expenses that come with life progression. Gen Z is paycheck to paycheck at 22, 23, 24, before the real expenses have even arrived. There's a meaningful difference between being financially strained after building something and being financially strained before you've started. One is the cost of having a life, the other is the cost of simply existing. That's the Gen Z money experience in 2025. Pillar 3, housing. This one surprises people, and then stops surprising them once you read past the headline. Gen Z's homeownership rate is actually higher than millennials was at the same age. 27.8% of Gen Z currently own homes. Millennials were lower at that age bracket. And before you say, see, Gen Z is fine, understand what that number is concealing. Gen Z homeowners are disproportionately concentrated in lower cost of living markets, in secondary cities, frequently with parental financial assistance or co-signing. The surface number looks fine, the texture underneath is completely different. And there's another figure that puts it in perspective. An estimated 1.82 million millennial and Gen Z households are currently missing, meaning those adults are living with parents, unable to form independent households at all. Harvard JCHS 2025. For millennials, the housing crisis was primarily about timing. The market collapsed, they waited, and eventually, in their 30s, many did manage to buy. The system was broken, but it was still theoretically accessible if you waited long enough. For Gen Z, the housing crisis is structural. Private equity has systematically acquired starter homes. Interest rates have made mortgages functionally unaffordable in most major metros. The median home purchase now requires an income that roughly 60% of entry-level workers simply don't earn. It's not that Gen Z is making poor financial decisions, the ladder was pulled up. And the people who pulled it up are not millennials. They're institutional investors and boomers sitting on appreciated assets. Gen Z is left standing in the lobby, watching the elevator close. Pillar 4, mental health. This is where the data is the most stark and the most consequential. 91% of Gen Z workers report experiencing mental health challenges at least occasionally, according to LIMRA's 2024 BEAT study. 71% of Gen Z employees score what researchers classify as unhealthy on workplace psychological well-being measures. For millennials, that number is 50%, already high, but 21 points lower. Let that sink in. Nearly 3 in 4 Gen Z workers are psychologically struggling at work on a measurable, documented basis. And this isn't abstract. It shows up in sick days, in productivity loss, in turnover, in people in their early 20s already questioning whether their career trajectory is survivable. That's not burnout. That's a structural collapse in real time. Millennials had significant mental health struggles too, anxiety rooted in concrete, nameable things. Financial pressure, political instability, student debt, the slow realization that the career path they were promised didn't exist. There was a directionality to it. They knew what they were anxious about. Gen Z's mental health profile is different in character. Researchers describe it as ambient dread, a more generalized, pervasive sense of malaise without a single identifiable source. Climate anxiety as permanent background noise. Algorithmic comparison culture operating 16 hours a day. Social isolation that started in adolescence and got institutionalized by a pandemic. 40% of Gen Z report feeling stressed or anxious all or most of the time, versus 34% of millennials. Deloitte, 2025, 6 percentage points, compounding daily for years. Pillar 5, physical health. Here's something that genuinely surprised me when I ran the comparison. Gen Z is, in several measurable ways, physically healthier than millennials were at the same age. Only 3.8% of Gen Z smoked in the last 30 days, compared to 28.5% of millennials. Fewer than 25% drink alcohol regularly, versus roughly 50% of millennials. Cannabis use is also lower, about 16% versus nearly 24%. Gen Z is, in the literal sense, more sober. Whether that's a value shift or simply an economic one, substances cost money Gen Z doesn't have, is an open question. But the physical data paints a meaningfully more positive picture than the mental health data. They're preserving their bodies while their minds absorb the structural damage their bodies escaped. The one physical health asterisk is exercise. Fewer than half of Gen Zers exercised at least once a week in recent tracking data, which matters for long-term cardiovascular and metabolic health outcomes. But the broader picture is clear. Gen Z inherited the mental health crisis of millennials, amplified it through algorithm-driven social environments, and added climate anxiety on top, while simultaneously managing to avoid many of the physical self-destruction patterns that defined early millennial adulthood. Different drug, same underlying symptom. The system produces the same broken output through a different mechanism. And that's not an abstraction. You're about to meet someone who lived all 5 of these pillars at once. His name is Marcus. Marcus is 26. Not a real name, but a real composite built from dozens of conversations, comment sections, and documented patterns. He did everything the script said, studied, graduated, got an actual full-time job at a marketing agency in a mid-sized city, not gig work, not contract, a real W-2 position with benefits. Starting salary, $42,000. His manager told him during onboarding, "When I was your age, I was making $28,000. You're in a good spot." And Marcus believed him, or tried to. But Marcus's rent was $1,450 a month. His student loan payment was $380. His car insurance jumped to $210 after an accident that wasn't his fault. He ran the numbers, they didn't run back. 6 months in, Marcus had his first performance review. His manager said he was performing adequately but could show more initiative. What his manager didn't know, because Marcus didn't say it, was that Marcus had been spending every lunch break sitting alone in his car in the parking garage. Not on his phone, just decompressing, because the open plan office and the constant ambient noise made his anxiety spike to a level where he couldn't think clearly for the second half of the day. He wasn't disengaged, he wasn't lazy, he was managing a mental load his salary didn't account for, and his workplace wasn't equipped to acknowledge. He started calling in sick more, not lying, actually sick, headaches, insomnia, a body sending invoices his budget couldn't pay. Month 8. Marcus made what looked from the outside like a bad financial decision. He put $2,200 on a credit card, a long weekend trip he could not afford, to a city he'd never been to, with a friend he barely saw anymore. It felt like freedom for approximately 72 hours. Then the bill arrived, and the number at the bottom of his monthly spreadsheet got worse. This is the moment people on the outside point to and say that's the problem. But that's not the problem. That's what happens when every responsible, disciplined choice still leaves you in the red. The trip wasn't irresponsibility. It was the behavior of a person who had run out of affordable ways to feel okay. Gen Z's credit card crisis lives in this exact sequence, replicated across millions of people. Month 10. Marcus found a remote job listing, same title, different company, $58,000 base. He applied because he was bored and tired. He got it. When he told his manager, the response was, "I thought you were happy here." Marcus didn't say what he was actually thinking. That happiness hadn't been the metric he was optimizing for. He'd been optimizing for survival. And survival just got a $16,000 annual upgrade. He relocated to a smaller city. Rent dropped from $1,450 to $950. He set up an automatic transfer to a high-yield savings account, something he'd read about for months but couldn't afford to actually do. The credit card debt was still there, but for the first time in 10 months, the math didn't require heroics to balance. He could breathe. Marcus's story doesn't end with a down payment and a retirement portfolio. It ends with him being able to make the math work, which, if you are a 26-year-old in 2025, is not a small thing. It is functionally the whole ballgame. The lesson here is not job hop your way to freedom or move to a cheaper city and everything resolves. The lesson is that Marcus spent 10 months grinding harder inside a system that was structurally incapable of rewarding him at the level his actual expenses required. The moment he changed the game he was playing, not the effort, the game, the numbers changed with it. Not because he became a different person, because he stopped accepting terms that were written for someone else's economy. That is the pivot. So, who has it worse? Millennials or Gen Z? The honest answer is that the question is framed wrong. Millennials got hit by a wrecking ball in 2008 and spent a decade rebuilding. Many of them are now stable, not necessarily comfortable, but stable. Gen Z was handed a world where that rebuilding already happened, but the benefits of it were captured by asset prices, institutional investors, and a cost structure that absorbed every wage gain before it could compound. They're employed, but financially strained. Physically healthier, but psychologically exhausted. Technically doing better on some housing metrics while being structurally locked out of the economic outcome those metrics were supposed to represent. Different game. Harder level. Here's something nobody says out loud about generational comparisons. They're almost always deployed to justify inaction. Millennials had it hard too, so stop complaining. That framing benefits exactly one group, the people who designed the current system and would prefer it not be examined too closely. The suffering of one generation is not evidence that another generation's suffering is exaggerated. It is evidence that something in the architecture is broken, and has been broken, in different ways across consecutive cohorts. When you see that clearly, the conversation shifts from who deserves sympathy to what actually needs to change. That is a more useful conversation, and it starts with understanding what you're actually working with. 4 things that actually shift outcomes, not theory, just the pattern I've seen work. 1. Stop benchmarking your timeline against your parents. That timeline was calibrated for a different interest rate environment, a different housing supply, a different labor market. Applying it to 2025 is like navigating with a map of a city that was demolished. The milestones didn't move because you're failing, they moved because the underlying infrastructure changed. 2. Understand that the financial pressure you feel is not a personal failure. Gen Z earns less in real purchasing power, carries more debt, and pays more for housing than millennials did at the same age. BLS 2024. That is a structural condition, not a character flaw. Name it correctly. 3. The mental health crisis and the economic crisis are not 2 separate problems. They are the same problem expressed in 2 different languages. You cannot meditate your way out of a 16% debt-to-income ratio. You cannot breathwork your way into a housing market. Therapy, community, and boundaries matter. They help you manage the load. But the root cause is systemic, and treating it purely as a personal wellness issue is how the system avoids accountability. Acknowledge both layers. Address what you can personally. Stop performing gratitude for conditions that deserve scrutiny. 4. The highest leverage move in almost every case study I've encountered is a change in the game being played, not an increase in effort applied to the current one. Marcus didn't work harder. He changed the terms. You are not behind. You are not weak. You are not the problem. You are the latest iteration of a generation trying to construct a life inside an economic architecture that keeps updating its terms without your input. Millennials figured out their version of that, slowly, painfully, often without a map. Gen Z is figuring out theirs. The ones who come out the other side are not the ones who grinded the hardest inside the original system. They're the ones who eventually looked at the system clearly, without the nostalgia, without the shame, without the comparison to a timeline that was built for a different economy, and decided to design the terms of the next move themselves. That's not toxic positivity, that's just the math. And the math, when you finally let yourself look at it clearly, is actually the most liberating thing in the room. See you next time.